Welcome everyone to the Columbia Justice Lab series on research and justice policy. In this speaker series, we have been exploring the relationship between research and policy, and we ask each of our speakers to address the theme of how research can help make public policy response to crime more effective in contributing to community safety. How can we make it fairer? How can we make it radically less punitive? We're very grateful to the support of Columbia's faculty for arts and science and former Columbia Dean Fred Harris for making this series possible. Before introducing my speaker, I'd like to make a couple of quick notes about format. This is a Zoom webinar, and the audience members are muted with their videos off. We're reserving time at the end of the hour to respond to audience questions. If you're on a Zoom, use the Q&A feature to pose questions at any time throughout the discussion, and our online moderator, Sam Plummer, will select questions for Andy to address after his presentation. Sam, do you want to chime in?
Sure. Hi, everyone. As Bruce mentioned, I'll be moderating the online Q&A. We will send any unanswered questions to Andy at the end of the talk. And please also feel free at any time during the presentation if you have technical questions or any questions to put them in the Q&A. Thanks.
Thanks, Sam. So it's really a tremendous pleasure to be able to introduce for our final speaker in this series this year, Andy Papachristos. Andy is the John G. Searle Professor of Sociology at Northwestern University. He's the director at the Institute for Policy Research and the founder and the faculty director for Corners, which is quite an extraordinary research, policy, and community partnership program that's focused on problems of urban violence, community safety at Northwestern. Andy's research is very well known to all of us. His work aims to understand how the connected nature of cities, how their citizens, neighbourhoods, and institutions are tied to one another. That's what we've pulled from the website for this introduction. But for me, I want to pull out three aspects of Andy's work, which I really love, and I think makes him a very distinctive voice in the field. Number one, there's this incredible analytical clarity about the work that Andy has been doing, particularly on gun violence and the way in which the structure of social networks comes to shape gun violence. And he does this work in a way that has enormous significance for our scientific understanding of that very, very difficult problem, but also has really compelling policy relevance. The second thing, which I think is tremendous and unique about Andy's work, is it's a fantastic writer. It's a fantastic social science writer, and I think for students who are in the room or listening, reading Andy's work, I think, provides a tremendous model of lucid social scientific writing. The third thing for me that really distinguishes Andy's work is this strong belief all throughout your work in the time I've known you, Andy, going back to Cambridge, a strong belief in the importance of community partnership in the work of doing science, and I think that is a problem that we've been grappling with in this whole speaker series for us as a university-based research centre. So I really couldn't think of any better way to conclude the series for this year than by hearing from Andy. His talk today is called Blueprints for Safety, Engaged Science, and the Story of Collaborative Gun Violence Prevention in Chicago.
Thank you. Let me start sharing screen. I have no idea where I'm supposed to look during this talk because there's like the computer and there's people here and there's people. So I'll do my best. First of all, big thanks to the team at the Justice Collaboratory, Paulette, Julie, Bruce, Sam, for having me out. Also, I wanted to thank you for the special writer consideration I have when I give a talk, which is I ask for pyrotechnics after the talk, and they're like, we couldn't do that, but we're going to hook you up with an eclipse. So if it's timed correctly, the eclipse will happen exactly at my last slide.
Wow.
We're going to see if Bruce can deliver on that. But more seriously, thank you. Thank you for the kind words. Thank you for coming out when you should have your glasses on and being outside. I'm also going to start by saying I'm going to do something I always tell my students not to do, which is to give a talk I've not yet actually given or really rehearsed before. But in fact, when Bruce and I were talking, one of the things that I'm trying to move on to right now is to really think at a bigger level about this last almost 6 years of work we've been doing in Chicago. It's been a privilege to be in partnership with just an amazing set of community and civic partners in Chicago, a great team of researchers. And actually, when we pull this work together, we see something, and what we see is something that's much bigger than singular programs. It is this, what in this talk I'm calling as about a blueprint for safety, or this idea of a civilian infrastructure and what that looks like. And actually today I'm going to talk about what that means for science and the future of science as well. So I'm just going to jump right in. Someone's going to give me the hook. If I need to look somewhere or click somewhere, please tell me, and we'll do that. So when we think about 2020, which we're going to be talking about for the rest of our lives, you know, most people in this room and online are going to know that in 2020 we had the single largest increase in gun homicides in recorded history in the US, which was about 35% in a single year, reaching levels almost as high as the 1980s. Right? This is an important fact. People have looked at this. People are going to continue to look at this. What's important about this for what I'm going to talk about today and kind of the future, the moment where we're at, is what also was happening in 2020, right? Again, we've heard this story before. This particular rise in gun violence happened both during COVID and yet another sort of reckoning around police violence, mass incarceration. And so in communities across the country, including Chicago, which I'm going to talk a lot about today, people wanted a response to gun violence that avoided, or at least some people wanted, one that avoided the sort of get tough, mass incarceration, overly harsh policing approaches. And actually, this is one of these instances, and we don't do this often enough, when we look at people in this room, scholars online, that focused on mass incarceration in the state, it actually had an impact in this dialogue, because we didn't have that conversation when I was a teenager in the 1980s, but we did this time. And one of the solutions that people started turning to were what we're just going to call today community violence interventions, right? CVIs for short. And I'm throwing the Giffords definition up here. Broadly defined, community violence interventions are non-punitive, often non-state actors trying to engage those who are most involved in violence to try to get them services to reduce essentially gun violence in sort of a non-punitive, but often a non-state fashion. I would add to this definition, which where I'll end, this also includes more broader community mobilization, community development. So the idea is not to pit root causes against the here and now, again, like we often do, but to find solutions that do those things in a particular way, right? So this started happening, and these sorts of programs were popping up across the country. Actually, they were always there, which is something I'll come back to later. But what we saw, to use a sports analogy, apologies, people that were on the sidelines started getting plenty of time. And in fact, city by city, what you saw, and these are 3 of our partners in Chicago, the Institute for Nonviolence, also Chicago Cred, what you started seeing was people really getting excited, developing, mobilizing. And the idea was, again, not just to have programs, but to build something bigger than just scattered programs. And in fact, this is, again, we've seen in this past couple of years, the development of professional meetings, associations. There were 2 in Chicago at the same time last week, right? The National Institute of Justice, a broader convening of national leaders. And in fact, we now have an office for gun violence prevention in the White House, the first of its kind, actually co-directed by individuals who have been in this space for decades, Gray Jackson and Robert Wilcox. So this is something much, much more than just a bunch of programs scattered throughout cities across our country. Something has happened. And I'm going to talk today, and I'll give you a roadmap in just a second, about several of our partnerships at Corners, which, as Bruce had mentioned, stands for the Center for Neighborhood Engaged Research and Science, right? We've developed partnerships. These are some of our partners that we'll talk about that we're developing and starting to pop up, but again, have built something so very much different than what we've seen in the past. But here's a bit of a, I'll use the word trap for a minute, but the dangers right now at the moment is that even as these things, this is just a short period of time. I mean, it seems like forever ago, but it was only 3 or 4 years ago when this sort of movement started, and I'm going to use the word movement over and over again. And before the ink was dry, before people could be hired or staffed, people were already asking the does it work question. Is it reducing violence? Right? These are organizations that couldn't even hire staff fast enough, that couldn't train staff fast enough, that didn't have data systems, as we're going to talk about, that couldn't track things, and people wanted to know about its efficacy. And part of what that's doing is putting the burden largely on Black and Latino organizations to prove they're working before they are up and running. And it's an important question, by the way. We need to answer this question. But to answer this question, we have to answer a much bigger question, which is, what is the work? And this is actually the question that many CBI organizations are trying to figure out. That's what they want to know. They want to know, how can I reach people? What is this more effective than that? You know, being unable to answer, how many outreach workers do you have? How many participants do you have? Those are really basic, even descriptive questions that tell us what is going on, help us answer the other question, but we couldn't even do that 5 years ago. But these are the sorts of questions that we're starting to come up, but really only one is being focused on by policymakers and funders. And a lot of the sort of folks on the ground really wanted to know about this other question. So I'm going to talk today about how we deal with these questions. And so, as it's in the title of the talk, the title of our center, right? This is an engaged process for us. We just call it research, right? We use from data science to interviews and field work and focus groups. There's a rigor to it. I'm going to use that word rigor because oftentimes when we talk about community engaged work, people think it's somehow lesser than other sorts of work, which is totally not true. But again, our team consists of folks with lived experience. We've hired folks from our partners. We've got social workers. We've got one lawyer. We've got PhDs, data scientists, field workers. But more importantly, it's not just our team, it's our partnerships. From start to finish, from design, from collecting surveys, from analyzing data, from writing reports, it's done in partnership with our community and civic partners. And I'm going to talk about that, give you plenty of examples. And this is really key, as I'm going to hope to show, to actually explain the findings. Sometimes the findings are null, but we're just like, oh, it doesn't work. We can now explain what's going on in ways you couldn't if all you did was airdrop in, get some data, come back with a report card, which is exactly what community organizations feared when people started getting grants and time conditions to them. And again, we've seen massive movement in this space. So here's what I'm going to do in the rest of the talk. I'm going to talk about the creation of this movement. I'm going to talk about our research design broadly, and then I'm going to talk about lessons learned. And in the lessons that I've got today, each one comes from a different set of data. And so I'm happy to go in any nerd direction anybody wants to go about focus groups, about quasi-experimental design, about spatial statistics and synthetic control group, wherever you want to go. But I'm going to give you the high level overview of the design. And then I'm going to talk about where, in a piece I'm finishing up right now with David Hero, about where we think the science of street outreach should go in the years to come, which I think is a hopeful sort of story. So let me talk about the creation of this movement based on the greatest city in the world, Chicago. And I'm calling it a movement I like that. And we have people from Oakland and New York in the room and nobody even said anything. Okay. Everybody agrees. But again, using this word movement for a particular reason, because it is more than just programs scattered. It is people that are coming together and trying to build something bigger. For the social scientists in the room, this is following our patterns of an organizational field developing in a very fundamental sense. The relationships between community organizations and the state, between non-state actors and state actors, funders and individuals, participants. I mean, it is a field that is developing, and it's got all the good stuff and bad stuff that come with it. And we've completely ignored that development as scientists, let alone as policymakers. So I'm not going to talk about 2020. I'm going to talk about 2016, because in Chicago in 2016, we had a spike that was bigger than the one in 2020. And during this time, right before this time, and again, it's a fractal of what we saw in 2020, we had the murder of Laquan McDonald, the videotape had been released, we had a mayoral election coming up, and we had a skyrocket in gun homicides. In 2016, community partners in Chicago's, funders in Chicago's, hats off to foundations during this time period, came together and said, we need to do something. Researchers as well, myself and other researchers in the city were called together. What are we going to do? We got to do something. We need to do something different. We want it to be a non-enforcement strategy. People weren't saying CDI then. And what they did was they went to an old idea, street outreach and community violence intervention. So street outreach, this idea that you're hiring individuals with lived experience to help reach, and it's an old idea. It dates back to the 1890s, the whole house, the settlement houses, right? Chicago area project in the 1940s, Clifford Shaw said that the best idea, the way to reach people who don't want to be reached is to hire people from the neighborhood that have the solutions built into them, that have the lived experiences that are part of that. They used to be called curbstone counselors, detached workers, but the general idea was roughly the same when we think about violence interrupters today. How do we hire, train people to reach those that are most needed services directly? These pictures come from Jim Short, who passed away a few years ago, in the 1950s in Chicago. The left one is from North Lawndale. Some of the members of the Vice Lords are sitting in those pictures. And that was, to go back one second, and this is something I'm working on in several projects. Street outreach was the policy du jour until about 1968. They had researchers working on it. There were evaluations happening. It was funded by the government. And if you follow historian Elizabeth Hinton's work, there was this abrupt shift from the war on poverty to the war on crime. And you went from street outreach workers to building police gang units in the same instant, right? And so this idea shifted and kind of fell out of policy favor until about the 1980s, early 1990s, when Herb Spergel redeveloped the Little Village Project. Herb's project was unique because it had street outreach, but it merged it with state entities, including parole, police, and the idea was to have a comprehensive look at gun violence. And I'll talk about the evaluation results in a second. That kind of also petered out, and we saw the resurgence of street outreach in the early 2000s with Cure Violence, which ushered a huge shift as a public health approach to gun violence. This idea that violence was a disease, literally, that it could be disrupted, and that one way to do it was to hire these workers, empower these workers to go in these spaces to help intervene. Important note, my first research job was on Herb Spergel's Little Village Project. I gave up a $20 an hour construction job to work for an $875 an hour research project. My wife made me do it. She was totally right, by the way. And then I also was on the evaluation team for Cure Violence, which will come back in a second. So my first research experiences were really sort of on these spaces, along with some other work with Tracy Mears and others in Chicago. In a recent article by David O'Rowe and colleagues, they've got I really encourage you to read this article, read the article. Don't just read what people say about the article, read the article. But one of the things the article has is a great summary of these different eras of street outreach work and this kind of level of delinquency prevention, this classical era. And by the way, there was a famous one in New York, the Youth Mobilization Project. There's Boston's Roxbury Project, LA, Chicago, St. Louis. It was well staffed. Researchers were involved. They collected a lot of data. The results were basically null. And in some famous instances in LA, it made things worse. Right? So a couple of gangs in LA got more cohesive, not less cohesive.
What year is that?
Late 1950s, early 1960s. Matt Klein was the guy in LA. And then when we shift to the modern era, including Burb's project as well as the Cure Violence Project, results are mixed. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, sometimes it's made things worse. And we've seen stuff in Philly, Baltimore, Chicago, LA, and so on, which is good, but it means we know some things, but we don't know a lot. But when we came to this new moment in Chicago in 2017, and not in Chicago at this time, but I'm getting called in to these meetings. I'm actually on the right-hand side at this photo here. My beard does not have any gray in it, just for anybody that's trying to track how I aged over the last 5 years. But this is a convening at the South Shore Cultural Center in Chicago that pulled together 100 or so outreach workers from some of these names you see on the screen. And they were all trying to think about, what are we going to do? How are we going to do it? How are we going to do it differently? There was a desire to improve the work, to improve the field. There was a desire, which was not easy, which was to get people to collaborate. So outreach organizations had been competing for funding. They often didn't like each other. They competed for staff and talent, and they would hire each other's staff, and it would cause drama. And in fact, getting them all in the same room was a big deal. And these were some of the big partners at the time. Just one thing in the bottom left, Communities Partnering for Peace is not a single organization, but it's a collaborative of about now 20 organizations. It started small. And one of the things they started doing was standardizing training, standardizing pay, standardizing certification, building capacity that they shared across groups that usually didn't share. And it changed the dynamic in the city. They also, at the same time, especially Ready Chicago and Chicago Cred, started bringing in lessons that were going on in the field outside. So especially from behavioral economics, individual level interventions, and they started using outreach as sort of a front end to work with individuals and then getting them into specialized programming, often paid, advanced peace, ROCA. There are other models that were going on at this time. And they said, look, we need this connection, but we need service, we need stuff for people. We need housing, we need therapy, we need jobs, we need education. I'll talk about Chicago Cred in a bit. So there was also innovation around this model as well. The core idea of empowering folks with lived experience remains at the front end, but then people started putting new stuff on the back end. Innovation should be happening. We shouldn't just be doing the same thing kind of over and over and over again. So we saw a couple of these things also popping up in Chicago. And I want to just say again, before COVID. So here's the growth of CDI organizations in Chicago from 2017, 2018, 2020. By the time COVID hits, every community area in Chicago that had higher levels of violence had some presence of outreach or violence prevention. That's huge. Was it enough? No, absolutely not. We'll talk about that in just a second. But it went from sort of a handful of communities and got bigger and bigger, and it was supported and it was coordinated in ways that were unprecedented in the city, including sort of under other sort of eras or regimes. And this was a big deal. By the way, this also messes with any of your statistical approaches looking for comparison groups. We'll talk about that later. But you saw the growth of a movement, the growth of the field, which was huge, all before COVID. So much so that in February, this is that same room, South Shore Cultural Center, this collective of organizations that we're talking about is lobbying for $400 million to try to bring this to scale in the city of Chicago right now, right? And it's not anywhere near scale. And I'll talk about that, how that has to do with interventions in a moment. But that's the governor on stage, the mayor's on stage, the police superintendent's on stage, funders are on stage, leaders are on stage, and all the audience are basically CVI organizations. So in 5 years, you go from having a bunch of small groups in a room, kind of feeling each other out, to having the governor come on stage and make a lobby for $400 million, right? It's a huge thing that happened in a short period of time that I went entirely gray, which is also relevant. So engaged research design, or as we call it at Corners, research design. Let me start with a question, but what I'm going to hope to do in this section is talk about two things which really matter. Designing research that accounts for both the realities of the politics of violence prevention and the realities of gun violence itself. We usually ignore both, thanks, Pastor Mike. We usually ignore both of those things, but the only way to account for those things, in my opinion, is to have an engaged approach, which by the way, brings in all the cutting edge methods you want, but does it in a slightly different way that helps you make sense of what's going on. Okay, so here's a question. Who remembers Skype? Anybody remember Skype? Okay, so because of these prior contacts I had had with the Little Village Project and Cure Violence, a lot of the people who were outreach workers at the time are now supervisors. And as there was movement going on in this field in Chicago, I started getting calls. Hey, they want us to do this. Can we talk to you? Hey, what do you think about this? I was flying back and forth. I was about to move back to Chicago, and they said, we did it. We're going to get all these groups in the room at the same time. Can you show up? And I'm like, I am there. And then they told me the date, and I'm like, the moving truck is at my house that day. I cannot be there. I will get divorced. Please, I can't be there. They're like, you should come on Skype. I'm like, that's a horrible idea. They're like, you should be on Skype. I'm like, that's a horrible idea. So I'm on Skype, and there's a room full of outreach workers. They're mean mugging each other, right? Because they don't want to be in the same room with each other. I'm a literal talking head on the screen. And I'm like, hey, let's do some research, right? And then they're yelling at me. My friends in the room are trying to like stop them from yelling at me because like, no, Andy, you have to listen to them. But it was a train wreck. One of the worst things I've done. I don't know who's online right now, but if you made me do it, thanks. There was a backdrop that I wasn't aware of at the time, which was hugely important. It was this report that was released by Chicago Beyond, which was, why am I always being researched? So I know that some of the outreach organizations in that room had been part of research projects because I was part of those projects, right? But historically, what universities and communities of color in particular don't have a great relationship. I'm not telling anybody in this room you don't know, but this report had come out to help empower community organizations to understand the research process and what a sort of fair, transparent, and just process could look like. And people were rightfully skeptical. Not only were they skeptical of each other, they were skeptical of researchers. Totally fair. And in fact, important, hugely important for the field. But rather than duck and dodge it, we spent a lot of time in conversation, in partnership, over meals, doing stuff, whiteboard stuff to try to figure out what it would look like. Often starting with, what questions are you going to ask? The first question everybody knows is you're waiting for a report card, and if you get a bad grade, you'll lose your money, right? And I want to talk about what past research has done just a little bit. At the time, there were about 200 or so outreach workers in Chicago. Sounds like a lot. There are 900 plus crews in Chicago, street crews, gangs. There are 20,000 or so individuals in networks that are of high risk and violence. 3 million people in the city, 200 outreach workers. What kind of coverage do you get with two? How do you drop a homicide rate? But at the same time, people didn't want to collect data because data was being used against them by the police, by other researchers. They didn't want to ask that question. They kept talking in our conversations. We want to track the things that we do. We want to track the good outcomes. We want to track the workforce. We want to, and I'm like, let's do it. How do we do it? And we had funders that were willing to be a part of this. And I'm going to talk in a second about one of the big things we did to get past this. But we know we needed to answer what was going on. So if you had, talking about the realities of gun violence. So gun violence is totally tragic, totally not random. We built our cities to look a particular way. Most of our models, statistical models, don't account for it. Some do, some can't. But how do we then build a research project like that? So those 200 outreach workers. We also fail in most of our traditional evaluations. We're like, oh, neighborhood A got outreach, its violence went up. Okay, so that didn't work, right? But let's look at some other stuff we know about gun violence. This is a hypothetical sort of model, a city with 2 neighborhoods, X and Y, 4 groups, A, B, C, and D. You can see there are members of a group, but they've got ties outside because gang ties are just one type of tie. Groups are embedded in larger family neighborhood structures, most of which are not oriented towards violence or crime or anything like that. But when you hire an outreach worker, you hire them because they know gang A, right? So if they're in touch with gang A, that's where their impact is potentially going to be. Maybe some spillover if you're lucky. They might not know anybody in gang B in the same neighborhood, let alone D or E. So if A's behavior goes down and B, D, and E's go up, it's going to look like a loss, even though it was gang A that really had the focus of the behavior, right? We couldn't answer that question. All you knew was they had a program and it went up or it went down. So we were trying to push people and explain to organizations, you need to collect information. Here's another example I'm going to come back to later. This is a real example now of one outreach organization and a couple of outreach workers on the west side of Chicago. Those purple dots are their participants. Those are people. Those dots are people with names and lives and families. Those purple dots are participants of this program that an outreach worker or two selected. The red dots are other individuals who have been shot. You can see these particular outreach workers have coverage on the right side, not the left side. You can also see that participants are highly interdependent. They're connected. It actually defines the groups and outreach work that's there. You can choose to ignore those interdependencies, which is what most of our statistical models do, even processes like randomization. You can just flip a coin, and those two purple dots are independent. But you see them, and you know they're not. But to understand that, you had to collect information, and nobody wanted to collect information. So we spent 9 months just talking. By the way, try asking a funder for 9 months to build trust, right? What are you going to do for 9 months? We're gonna hang out. We're going to do this right. It was really hard. But what we did was, rather than us build instruments for ourselves, we had organizations build data capacity for themselves. And we had funders that were willing to support building of data capacity and infrastructure for these groups, so that they weren't making a choice between hiring an outreach worker and a data analyst. And we asked them, well, what do you want to know? Well, we want to know A, B, C, and D. We're like, well, what about asking this question on intake? But what it allowed us to do was it allowed them to control their data and hold it for their organization, but collect all the information they wanted on it. And here's the thing we did. We created a totally cumbersome and inefficient way to take that data and analyze it that let them retain information, which was they would collect data before the pandemic. They would collect their data, and we would come once a quarter and sit down with our computer in their house, match data to administrative records with them sitting side by side, looking at the code, do the match, de-identify it, erase everything from our computers, and then walk away, so that they retained all their sensitive information. We walked away with a sanitized data set, and we did everything side by side. And they got very comfortable then with that process, so much so that over Zoom, during the Zoom era, we did it virtually, right? And which would have been unheard of before COVID. But they had the power of having access to their data. They could run their own reports. We helped them figure out how to run templates and reports. It was actually really great. From there, it created a problem, which was then they wanted to know answers to all kinds of questions that we didn't have data on. So I'm going to talk about some of these later on throughout the talk. But together, we drafted survey items together. We collected interviews and focus groups together. We would train outreach workers who would do focus groups at other outreach organizations, not their own. They would interview their own staff, but they had a sort of credibility and reach. They got into it. We've written reports together, field observations. So we build a bunch of instruments in that same fashion, build it collectively, give ownership of the data. We get to use data. We get to be in partnership with data. And it just expanded the types of questions we could ask. And I'm going to show you some of those things there. It's probably dangerous, but before I'm going to take a dramatic sip of water, are there any clarifying questions before I go through the lessons where I'm going to double click into a bunch of the stuff I see people's faces wanting to hear more about? No. Okay. Let's start with the lessons learned. Lesson number 1. Actually, the lesson that should always be number 1, which we never acknowledge, which is CBI programs find the right people, okay? Without using the criminal justice system. They're finding people who don't trust institutions, people who don't want to be found, people who avoid contact with systems, even helping systems, right? And outreach workers do this in a non-punitive setting. This is huge. This is potentially transformative if we think about how this can be leveraged for changing dynamics around gun violence. Just to talk, this is something we couldn't have done until we started tracking who their participants were. So there's Chicago's homicide rate, or fatal and non-fatal shooting rate in Chicago, which is high, by the way. I know you know that. It doesn't look high here. Those are the communities that CP4P is in, double that of Chicago. The rate of victimization of the participants is 10 times that. So even if you had a 50% reduction, it would still be 5 times higher. But they're connecting with those individuals. That is massive and a huge important thing for when we think about the potential, what you could do around connecting with people outside of the criminal legal context. Lesson 2. And this is one of the things I'm going to end on. So we talk about these as violence intervention programs. This is so much more than violence intervention. These are community institutions that mobilize everything from voting drives, housing, expungement, food. And we're just talking about them as violence prevention entities, which they are. But before we did some of this work, we weren't able to quantify what that meant. So because of that data I just mentioned, we were able to track every participant, probably undercounting, let's be honest, that went through CP4P for about 5 years. It's about 7,000 participants, almost 120,000 contacts. What do we learn? You can't read this, I'll read it for you, but let me just point out, violence prevention was the third most type of contact that they did. So the interventions, the mediating between disputes, the non-aggression agreements, that wasn't even the number one thing outreach workers did. The number one thing outreach workers did, mentoring, employment services, resource referral, education, victim advocacy, housing, legal, recreation, family engagement, substance abuse, life skills, physical health. That's what they're doing, right? If you followed an outreach worker around on their daily schedule, that's what you see. They're canvassing, looking, talking to people, but they're delivering food, they're checking in on somebody that's homework, buying somebody a suit for a job interview, helping with the resume. And they're only getting pitched as one type of organization. They're only being evaluated on one dimension. We've ignored all these other dimensions as scientists and understanding the importance that is for building community safety. We have a couple of reports, which I won't talk to about today, but we actually saw this during COVID. In Chicago, they were frontline workers, handing out PPEs, food. They were bringing Wi-Fi hotspots so kids could still go to school. And when kids didn't have a computer, they brought a printout of homework to people's school. And that is violence prevention for outreach organizations. It's not just standing between people that are warring. And we don't acknowledge that as researchers, let alone as policymakers. And yet we can study it and know how to study it. So I'm going to zoom through this. There's a lot here. I don't know what that face is for, but we're going to keep going. This is a field in need of support. And we conducted what's called VIEWS, the Violence Intervention Worker Study. A shout out to the team at SUNY who've been co-investigators in this, and big shout out to Chris Patterson and Jalen Author, who are coming from Chicago Cred. Chris is currently at Crown Family Philanthropies, but he was with the Institute for Nonviolent Chicago. People wanted to know about their workforce, and we had no information on the workforce. So we developed a survey to survey every worker in Chicago. We've since expanded to New York State and Boston. When we had this survey and we went to Chris and Jalen, it was a tight 45 minutes. Chris and Jalen got it, it was 90 minutes plus, because they had so many questions. And I'm not going to talk about all of these things, but we looked at things like basic demographics, supervision, exposure to violence, economic well-being, attitudes about law and policy. So lots and lots of things in this study. And in Chicago, by the way, you look at these response rates, 2 reasons for the response rates. David had worked and I had worked on different surveys, especially the Boston Reentry Study, about how you track and follow populations over time. By the way, outreach workers know how to find people, right? And they were invested in it. So we did a near complete census in Chicago of every outreach worker in the city. And you see the same things emerging from Boston and New York. So I'm going to zip through this. The punchline is the average outreach worker in Chicago, New York, and Boston is a 44-year-old Black man. What's the average age of a gunshot victim? Chicago, everyone guess?
18.
26. So higher, still a 20-year gap between outreach workers and the people they're participating with. The gender gap. And so bringing this up, I'm bringing it up because as soon as outreach workers saw this, they were like, we're 20 years off. We can't relate with, how can we relate? Is that good? Is that bad? And what about the role of women, right? Female outreach workers are quite influential and powerful, and yet they're not represented in the workforce. So the field took this and started talking about and devising new ways to think through these things. I want to summarize this, and I want to spend time on the lessons. I got a 5-minute mark. One of the things that every outreach organization that I've talked to in the last 5 years wants to discuss, but is afraid to discuss, is the safety of their workers, right? So if you think about where they are, why they're hired, their personal experiences with incarceration, gun violence, gang membership, these are individuals who are going to a job with a lot of history, and they're doing things that we don't ask other people to do. And so we asked a series of questions. This is the best summary of the kind of this part of the scholarship, which has been published in different spaces. 32% in Chicago, 33% in Boston, 23% have witnessed someone shot on duty. A quarter have witnessed somebody killed on duty in front of them. 20% in Chicago have been shot at on duty. 2% have been shot and hit. That figure has doubled that of police in Chicago during the same time period, right? So these are largely middle-aged Black men with prior contact with the justice system who have insane exposure to violence on their own work, on their daily work, right? And they have symptoms, as we've written about elsewhere, with post-traumatic stress, secondary traumatic stress, losing sleep, not being able to concentrate, all the sort of symptoms that come along with it. And then we want to ask ourselves, why isn't this program working, right? Because the workforce needs help, and we're not giving it there. I will skip over this and come back to it if it's time, but here's what the average salary is in Chicago, Boston, and New York, which means, not surprisingly, people are working extra jobs. So they're working, by the way, street outreach work is not like a 9 to 5, just so we're clear. This is weekends and nights. These are hard shifts. So on average, they're working over 20 hours a week, and they're struggling to pay rent. They're struggling to pay utilities. They now have health insurance coverage, which is a super interesting conversation because many don't know they have health insurance coverage, and they're racking up ER and urgent care bills, try to get paid back from Blue Cross Blue Shield. You have to fax things. Who's got a fax machine? It's probably with Skype someplace. So here's where I'm going to close. I'm going to close fast about this. Are we having an impact? The short answer is yes. We hope. It's really hard to tell for many of the reasons we've talked about. We've got 2 papers that are coming out. One that has leveraged the timing of things and created synthetic control groups to look at the impact, to have some comparison group. I don't like the fact that it's still an aerial unit, but what we've been able to do is create sort of some kind of quasi-experiment using these kind of synthetic control groups. One of the things we've done, which past research hasn't done, is going back to the realities of how gun violence happens. We've eliminated proximate neighborhoods. So there's spillover, both in sort of group ties, markets, and other things. But we created control groups weighted on these combinations. And what did we find? What we found, which was important and different from past results, was no things in the wrong direction, right? 30% of each one of these dots, by the way, is a different organization in Chicago. So 3 organizations had lower rates relative to their post-treatment lower rates relative to comparisons. All went in the right direction. Only 3 were statistically significant. To translate this into real people, it's about 383 fewer homicides and non-fatal shootings. That's about 7 a month in Chicago. First time we presented this, I was all excited. It's like, we got good news. This is great. And many of the outreach organizations were all bummed. I was like, that's 7 a month. That's a lot. So people were really kind of working hard to be excited about it. But that's a big win. And again, consistent with past research, it doesn't work all the time. Why doesn't it work? Those are the questions that we're now trying to figure out. Sorry, I know we're way past time. We had a paper that came out around Chicago Cred. A similar study came out with Ready Chicago around the same time. These are phased paid programming, so very intense treatment at an individual level programming. And one of the things we did here was we had a treatment group and we wanted to select comparison groups. And what we did was not randomize. I showed you the sort of figure before, where if you flip the coin, the 2 purple dots, we know they know each other. And so rather than ignore that, we decided to model that, which is pick from this tragically huge, massive network in the rest of Chicago, most of which is not getting any treatment. So we were able to match comparisons between one person who had treatment and multiple people who did not. And we cut this all sorts of different ways. It's like a 40-page appendix, roughly the same results. What did we find? Remarkably, and I think this is a good moment for science, we found the same thing, roughly the same thing that Ready Chicago found with a randomized controlled trial and a quasi-experimental design. Same city, similar program, same time period, different methods, which was minimal impact on victimization, bigger impact on arrests. And there were lots of reasons why we were able to understand the why. Why did that happen, right? Rather than just say it didn't work, what was going on? We were able to, because of this engaged process, talk about and understand what the kind of failures were. And victimization, gunshot victimization, is tricky for all sorts of reasons. It's really hard to model for all the reasons I've showed you. It's statistically rare, right? Even in cities with lots of violence in Chicago, the Ready study had 1,500 individuals and it was still underpowered to detect change. Part of the reason is people were selected because they were already shot. So it wasn't actually victimization, it was repeat victimization, which is still less than 2% of people who were ever shot. So that it gets impossible to model, it's dynamic. And the thing that really stood out, and this came from an interview, was you were still only reaching a small subset of individuals. And here's the line that's in the paper that came from an interview. People had control over what they had control over. The failures, the people who were shot, they got their GED, they went to the program, they completed the program, they got shot while they were waiting for a bus because the ops didn't know, that they had changed their behavior. And they describe it, as you see in this quote, as playing defense with the rest of the neighborhood still playing offense. So the individual limitations of these sorts of efforts are massive. And that's one of the things we saw in Chicago Cred. And I'm sure we'll talk about that later. So where should we go? And this is the wrap up. The first is we have to move beyond violence as an outcome. Can't ignore violence. The does it work question is right, but does it work to increase community collective efficacy or perceptions of safety, or people stop carrying guns? What does it mean to be successful in this space? It's not just about lowering homicide rates. It's part of it. It's a big part of it, but we have to, and we know how to measure those things. We know how to do it. We just don't do it. We have to center community practices, actions, and structures. That graph I showed you, none of that gets tallied anywhere. Nobody gets credit for that, right? All they get credit for are interventions, non-aggression agreements. It's much bigger than that. We know as researchers and scientists how to do that as well. It needs to be part of those conversations. We need to expand the methods we use. We need to eliminate certain types of language from our conversations. This idea of a gold standard, that there are certain right methods for right questions is 100% true, but we can't negate qualitative work to just being stories. We have to recenter participatory work, and we have to engage scholars from backgrounds in these spaces as well. We have to look at the workforce itself. I think I've started to give you some insights into how important that is to success. Why isn't it working? I have a traumatized workforce that's 20 years older than the people they're trying to reach. Maybe we need to build more around those spaces. And there's innovations happening in this space, by the way, right now, which I'm happy to talk about. And the last thing is study the field as a field. Study the relationship between CBI organizations and state actors, funders, government agencies, other realms. They don't exist by themselves independently, and that becomes really important. And the last thing I want to leave, this is a mural from the Metropolitan Peace Academy's new training academy, which was just launched this last year, where all of the outreach workers in Chicago come for in-service trainings and events. And really, one of the things that's happening here is that, community outreach work is this site of basic democratic struggle in a very fundamental sense to construct citizenship, where racial exclusion, intense poverty, violence, ineffective policing, and disinvestment has been the rule in the neighborhoods in Chicago. And you're starting to see these threads of hope that are happening and innovation that are happening. And when I first started doing this work in 2017, one of the outreach leaders in Chicago, Tenny Gross, his group works from a Kingian perspective of nonviolence. And I was like, well, what's your goal? What do you want to do? He's like, to build the beloved community. And I said to Tenny, Tenny, how do you measure that? And at the time, I was being intentionally, to get him. Turns out we know how to measure that. We just need to do it. And that's where I'll stop for the moment.
That is terrific, Andy. I got a million questions, but I want to turn first to the room. Any questions for Andy?
I have two totally unrelated questions. First one is how you think about the amount of time it takes for any of these interventions to work and how you kind of model that. It seems like these programs that are about nonviolent interventions, especially in the context of changing one person's behavior when they are affected by another person's behavior, might take quite a long time and not conducive, as you said, to the kind of gold standard causal models that funders, I think, often want these kinds of organizations to use. The second question has to do with an article that came out a couple of days ago, I think, about an organization in New York in Crown Heights, and I think also a kind of nonviolent intervention in their relationship with the police, which is quite adversarial, and how you kind of see that play out in Chicago, and how people deal with that kind of navigating both the violent interventions to violence and the nonviolent interventions to violence.
So those are both good questions. Let's start with the light ones.
Okay.
Of the police. Way to go. Let's start with the second one first, and we'll move to the first one. So the relationship with the police is totally complicated. I just saw the article this morning, by the way. The reason outreach organizations believe they're effective and impactful is precisely because they're not the police.
Right.
They can be places that police cannot be, that they can have relationships, and that in fact, making sure there's some distance from the police is vital to doing their jobs. Many organizations believe that. That's different than having an antagonistic relationship with the police. But that then comes down to individual cops and individual outreach workers, because many of the cops arrested the outreach workers, probably put them in jail 10 years ago. And so it's super complicated. I don't have an answer for it, but what I can tell you on the ground from Chicago is they're trying to create lanes. They're trying to create avenue to share broad level, like crime rates, statistics, hotspots, without creating tensions between any individual information sharing. Often that happens at the level of like an executive director, right? So the person who's not the outreach worker, but the person that runs organizations that has to have a relationship with City Hall or the police department. The problem is and this goes back to the does it work question, and we've seen this happen with organizations across the country. The margin of error for somebody doing an outreach worker doing something wrong is razor thin, which is actually, of course, not the truth for police officers,
Right.
who have lots of protections around their jobs. Outreach workers, and I will tell you what's I see on the ground is that outreach organizations go far to make sure that their employees are out of the life or far enough away to not jeopardize their own organization. So there's a lot of vetting. Actually, hiring outreach workers is not easy. Just to be clear, it's not like you just show up. Oh, there's a job. You have 1,000 applications. You got to pick 5. They're vetted. They're recruited. You know, they're really going through a tough process. On the first question, this issue of methods. So first of all, causal methods are important. I'm doing them myself. There's this issue of cadence and there's this issue of narrative. So it is absolutely true that if researchers want to be impactful in this space, they have to have multiple rhythms, right? We have to have long-term, it takes 3 years plus to understand things like recidivism or patterns. So you have to have skin in the game for a long period of time. It doesn't help an organization who's got to report something back. And so you need to be able to understand there are multiple ways to produce knowledge, right? So you can give a table back that's got crosstabs on something with big bold letters that says not causal on the bottom, right? Or you can report back internally and provide feedback. But that doesn't get anybody elected. And it's a tough conversation that I don't have all the answers into, other than to say you just can't do only the causal work. If you can't explain why it doesn't work, or why, by the way, the null results do not necessarily mean it doesn't work. It means we actually don't know, right?
No, totally, yeah.
And that's not how it gets painted. It's like, doesn't work. No, it's actually, we don't know. And so, that's why you need to build in these other, and it's not just, let's do some interviews. You should do interviews, but it's actually being in that space to understand what are the most important kind of questions, driving people's program theory. Like, what is the theory to change? I mentioned selection bias. Selection bias isn't a methodological problem here. It's actually the theory of the programs, right? We are going to select people a particular way. We can model that. We know how to model that. It might not be through randomization. It might be, but you model it through system dynamics. These are new fields we use every day. It's on everybody's phone. You guys use your maps on your phone. There's predictive algorithms on your phone, right? And so there are promises there, but it requires being honest, kind of more than anything else. Question. I'm not taking the cue. I'm gonna let somebody else take the cue.
Let's take one more and then we'll go to the online group. Sure.
Thank you. I have to leave in 5 minutes because I'm teaching, so apologies. You mentioned, I was very interested in the graph where you were showing the gap, or the age gap between, the average outreach worker and the average age of the person who is shot in Chicago. How should we think about either preserving that or trying to reduce it? Because I think it can go both ways. I can see, people who are involved in violence, seeing that age gap as a barrier to engage, or I can see also that these are individuals who've aged out of, engaging with criminal activity, and perhaps they have some credibility on the streets. Do you see any evidence in the data that, when you're stratified by age, things look different?
So this is a great question. It's a question that the outreach community is trying to answer right now.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you what they're doing, and then the answer goes back to this other question, which is stay tuned. So first of all, the reason we don't know why it's 44 yet, and this is a longitudinal survey, so stay tuned. We'll kind of understand. We don't know if they're 44 because they've been in a job for 15 years, or if they're 44 and they got their job when they were 41.
I see.
But what we do know is that they were incarcerated during the early 20s,
I see.
right? And so they were taken out of the workforce for an important period of their development. So what's happened, and people don't know. So there is this idea of like a benevolent uncle or aunt,
yeah,
right? That's a little older, but not too old. Like they're not 80, they're 40.
Yeah.
And I'm 48, so I like to think of myself like that. But at the same time, the 26-year-old might be too close to
Yeah.
your point. What they're starting to do is they're innovating in Chicago with a program called Flip, which was on there, which is almost like a summer jobs program for people that want to get into violence prevention who are a little younger. The problem is they're also closer to the dynamics that are still happening.
I see.
And so to answer your question, we're actually following that right now.
Mhm.
It's clear that the folks from Flip have higher levels of exposure to violence, like even higher than the ones we're already seeing. I don't have a number for you, but we can count them.
Mhm.
And yet at the same time, the hope is that they'll quickly move into a field that has other opportunities. What those 44-year-olds often don't have is an off-ramp. Like if you're an outreach worker, what's next? Outreach supervisor? And then,
Yeah.
I mean, there's need for a lot in this space, but there's not a lot of differentiation yet, which is happening, going back to why it's a field, right? You're seeing the development of new victim services, trauma response, hospital-based programs, advocacy programs. So the field is now creating more needed positions, which means these 44-year-olds might not need to be walking that same street they were shot on 20 years ago anymore, and they can still help, as well as go on to other jobs like work for me or go to manage a store or go into education. And so I think there's a lot of innovation happening here and to be continued. But I think that conversation is happening among community organizations, and that's really, they're the ones creating the program, Flip, to try and solve that problem. And we don't know yet. It's a great question.
I've been slacking with Sam at the same time, and her Zoom connection's just gone down. So I'll ask a couple of the online questions. Two of the questions are interested in the relationship between CVI organizations and police. So Michelle Phelps is interested in how do you explain variation in the relationship between police and different community groups? How important is history? A history of relationships. Jeremy Travis has a similar question. He's also interested in the relationship, not just between CVI and police, but what about other public sector agencies like social service agencies, housing services, education? Do you see these other relationships in your work? What about the role of prosecutors? Where are they, Jeremy?
So these are great questions. I have somewhat easy, but obviously super complicated answers. On the relationships with police and individual CVI organizations, Michelle's question, honestly, it comes down to the individual police commander. And actually you see this in neighborhood after neighborhood in Black and Latino neighborhoods in Chicago, where if you have a proactive, forward-thinking police commander who wants to develop good relationships with outreach organizations, they have. And if all they want to do is jump out gang units, that's what you get to. And then community organizations hold their breath until the next police commander. What you have seen in the city of Chicago, which is at the city level, not necessarily the police level, is the development of these offices for public safety, which are including in discussion CVI organizations in deep, meaningful, profound ways. So there are connections with the city, and then I would say the relationship with the police department varies by commander. On Jeremy's question, great question. And this is something, again, in cities like Chicago that are developing these offices, they're trying to formalize relationships between outreach and other city and public agencies. Housing, you mentioned, DCFS for kids and people that have kids. You know, one of the interesting things, the conversations that are going on are schools. Turns out, because most outreach workers have felony convictions, they can't work in schools. And so it's a huge focus of a lot of activity, but a huge space they cannot be in formal ways. And so that is something that's opened up in Chicago in particular, because they're removing police officers from schools. And so they're trying to find other alternatives to have safety and sort of interventions on schools. Prosecutors and public defender's office, that's a good question. There's not a lot of action happening between prosecutors and public defender's office at the moment. And these organizations, although they've been in many of the same spaces around diversion and intervention efforts, but I haven't seen yet, I could be missing it, but I haven't seen yet sort of formal activity happening.
Sadly, our time is up for today, and I feel like we're just beginning to scratch the surface on a really deep and rich, important conversation that Andy has started with work that he's been doing in Chicago. So please join me in thanking Andy. Thanks so much. This is brilliant. I'm looking forward to continuing the conversation through the day. This is the last talk, the Justice Lab speaker series on social science research and justice policy for the year. We've really enjoyed bringing voices from across the field to you, and we hope you will join us when the series resumes in the fall. You can find updates on the series and on the events of the lab on our website, and I hope you check into that. So thank you very much, everyone, and we'll see you next time.